down the road, say 5 years from now, we may find that recalibration may not work. If it doesn't work, then what? There are a lot of issues that arise that have to do with the future of our alliances in Northeast Asia and the future of US security policy in the region. So those are some of the questions we want to get into today. And without talking any more, let me introduce our two panelists. John Wolfstall on the end there. I can't remember how long I've known you, John, but it's almost 30 years probably. And I'm not going to run through his whole resume, but he's worked in the non-governmental world. I remember the first time I met John was when he was at the Arms Control Association. Since then, he's held a number of jobs at the Carnegie Endowment, at the Monterey Center. He has government experience. He worked for Vice President Biden in the Obama administration and on the National Security Council also during the Obama administration, and now he's at Global Zero. And to my immediate left is Jenny Town, who I think, as most of you know, is now the director of the 38 North program here. And I wanted to point out that she has just recently completed a report that looks at extended deterrence based on a year-long project, a big part of which was dialogue with prominent South Koreans. So on that note, I think what we'll do is each of the speakers will have about 10 minutes to talk, and then we'll have a moderated discussion. And I think during the course of that discussion, we'll certainly take questions from the people here in the room and also from people online. So John, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Jenny. And thanks to both Stimson and 38 North for giving me the chance to speak here. And thanks for coming in person. It's strange to see three-dimensional objects in front of me, so I'll try to adjust here. So I first traveled to the Peninsula in 1995 when I worked for the Department of Energy and actually went to North Korea. It should be, if it's not. Yeah. Okay. Oh, thanks. All right. Thanks. Nice to be here. You're three-dimensional. So I first traveled to Korea in 1995 when I worked for the Department of Energy and visited North Korea. I worked at the Yongbyon nuclear facility as part of the agreed framework. And I didn't actually travel to South Korea until about the year 2000. And so I joked that, of course, I know North Korea much better than I know South Korea, which isn't quite true because nobody really knows North Korea. And I've since traveled to South Korea many times, and I'm actually leaving tomorrow for my first trip in about 5 years. So my comments are probably a little out of date, and my perceptions are definitely from a distance. So I think you'll be able to rely on other people for sort of the latest thinking inside both the South Korean government and population. What I was asked to do today was try to set some of the understandings about what extended deterrence is and isn't, how it works and when it doesn't work, and some implications for the extended deterrent relationship with South Korea in particular, because every deterrent relationship is different, and the challenges facing the US and South Korea are unique, just as the challenges facing the US and NATO are unique, and the challenges facing the US and Japan are unique. So what is extended deterrence? In a very basic way, it's an effort by the United States, we are the main country providing extended deterrence to other people, to try to reassure our allies that we will be able to deter aggression against them, and if needed, to defeat it with all of the tools at our disposal, including nuclear weapons, because we are a nuclear weapons state and have a large, diverse nuclear arsenal. But in particular, it's also designed not just to reassure allies, but it's designed to deter the aggressor state or the potential aggressor state by projecting the ability and willingness to inflict enough damage to counteract the benefits of any attack. the basics of deterrence, the pain you will feel is worse than the gain you will get, are trying to be applied by a nuclear weapon state to a non-nuclear weapon state as part of an alliance. And the way I've always talked about this is that this is an incredibly unnatural act for a sovereign state to sign up to. It's both difficult for the state being protected because they don't have full agency over their security, and it's difficult for the state extending that assurance because you are, in essence, saying, we will trade Seattle for Seoul. It's tough and it's hard. And we have now 60 years of experience doing this in Europe, and gets to my next point, which is that it's never perfect. Extended deterrence is not an end state, it's a process. It's a dialogue. And some would say it's a never-ending process because the dangers that our allies face change. The leaders in our country and in other countries change. The global circumstances change. And they all require extensive dialogue and coordination among allies, essentially to have constant care and feeding to ensure that this works. The other expression I've used in this context is that reassurance is like a bottomless bucket. There is always room for more, and you will never get to the top. And if you think about it that way, as opposed to if we just sort of tailor it a little bit more and get this one thing in, then we'll be set, I think you're missing the concept. Because within NATO, we have a regular dialogue with our other 29 allies to get extended deterrence right. And we may feel that we've got it right, and everybody's reassured, but then we may find out that our potential adversary doesn't believe us. And so that dynamic constantly changes. In some ways, it's much easier because we have a bilateral relationship with South Korea. And so as long as we have that dialogue ongoing and we think ahead, as Joel has said, then we have a better chance of getting things right. The last thing is an extension of the first 2 points, which is that extended deterrence, like deterrence itself, is about both capability and intent. And capability is relatively easy. It's not easy. You spend a lot of money on your defense and military capabilities, your training, your coordination, your exercises. But compared to intent, capability is something you can point to, you can see. If necessary, you can deploy and use. There's a reason that we didn't have the same type of instability in the extended deterrent relationship when we had nuclear weapons deployed in the theater, or when we had the Tomahawk land attack cruise missile deployed on submarines, and we said to our Japanese and our South Korean allies, this weapon is for you. It is the means by which we will protect and defend you. It's the shiny object deterrence concept. And when that weapon was retired, because it turns out it was no longer reliable and didn't work, there was a gap created in the minds of allies because they said, well, wait a second. You said that weapon was for us. What's for us now? And we said, well, we have these other 4,000 operable nuclear weapons that are deployed in lots of different ways that work. That wasn't the same sort of satisfying process. And so we find ourselves now in this extended deterrent dialogue. So with that as a baseline, what are the major challenges to extended deterrence today in the bilateral relationship? So I see 3. The first is clearly North Korea and their nuclear capabilities. It presents a major security and a political challenge to the alliance. And we can see the DPR statements last week about the new legal standard for managing their nuclear capabilities is putting additional pressure on both the United States and in South Korea to understand and potentially to respond. Now, I don't speak Korean. I'm relying on some of the translations for the new law that was adopted. I can tell you at my first read that I don't see a lot that's really new in the statement. We've known that North Korea has nuclear capabilities. We've known that they're under the direction of the leader, and they have said in the past that they are prepared to use them preemptively if necessary to defend their security. There were a lot of details that I think are worth trying to understand better. In particular, there was a lot of time in the statement spent on command and control. I think it seems to me to be echoing a lot of what the United States and other nuclear weapon states say about how they manage their nuclear affairs. I don't know whether they have the same level of capability to manage and secure their nuclear arsenal as the United States. I would doubt it. And so they may be saying things about intent that don't necessarily match up with how they actually operate. I worry a lot about pre-deployment and pre-delegation of nuclear capabilities in North Korea. But again, I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done on this. But I will say that I'm surprised. One of the things we did not see out of North Korea is a mirroring of what we've seen in Russia during the invasion of Ukraine. In Russia, you now see a nuclear weapon state not only invading a non-nuclear neighbor, but saying if other nuclear states try to intervene or interfere, we will use nuclear weapons against them. They're using nuclear weapons as a shield to try to protect their invasion. I was surprised we didn't see more language along those lines by North Korea to try to deter the United States and other allies from reinforcing South Korea in the event of a crisis. So again, I think there are threads that we need to pull on to understand a bit more the thinking going on in North Korea, because we don't have a very good understanding. I'll try to tighten things up here because I'm going long already. The second major challenge, obviously, is China. It's a longer term challenge, but it's clear that in the United States, while we worry about North Korea, the longer term organizing challenge for the United States is the confrontation with China. That is something that will involve the bilateral relationships and extended deterrent relationships with Korea and with Japan, and also be a driver for the trilateral alliance management that we have seen revived over the past year. The dynamics in the ROK and the requirements to provide extended deterrence to the ROK and Japan in the face of China is in many ways much more complex than in trying to provide extended deterrence to South Korea in the face of North Korea. China is a much larger state, much more economically powerful, has many more nuclear weapons, has a much more advanced conventional military. That poses a different set of challenges that require attention. But it's more difficult because in South Korea, the focal point of North Korea is easy to see, and it is harder to have a more blunt, direct conversation about the challenge posed by China. There's been some balancing that we've seen over the past decade or two with regards to China. I think that's changing somewhat under the Yoon government. It's been easier to talk about some of the challenges that China poses, but that's going to be an ongoing process as well. And then the last thing, and I'm from New York, Joel and I get along on this front, we're pretty blunt talkers. The big challenge that I see long-term is US domestic and international instability. We are less predictable than we were 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that is having an influence around the world, in Europe and in South Korea and in Japan, as well as in the minds of our adversaries. And so we just have to recognize that it's not just a Democrat or Republican challenge, that managing the alliance requires stability and predictability and sustainability. And that has been harder for the United States to do in this particularly divided period of time. And it also means that we have to be careful not to overly rely on the capability card, because you can have lots of capability, but if your intent is no longer credible, the capability loses value. And so the ability to integrate the alliance across the board, not just militarily, politically, economically, and this will get to many of the things that Denny will talk about, I think, become much more important. So the last point, and then I'll turn things over. In thinking about South Korea's desire to be able to rely on the United States, many people in the nuclear deterrence field and in the nonproliferation field worry that if the United States isn't able to demonstrate and isn't able to be credible that we will protect and defend South Korea no matter what, that it will increase the desire of South Korea to pursue their own independent nuclear capabilities. Or it might lead South Korea to say, we want the United States to deploy more strategic assets, including possibly redeploy nuclear weapons to South Korea in order to show us that you're really here for the long term. But the flip side of that is an increasing desire, which is understandable and actually follows a lot of what we've seen in NATO, a concern that in the South Korean government and the South Korean military, that they also want to be sure the United States isn't going to use nuclear weapons against North Korea and potentially even against North Korean troops on South Korean territory without the explicit permission of the South Korean leadership. Not only do South Koreans want to make sure that we will go when necessary to nuclear weapons, but they also want to make sure that you won't go nuclear unless we say so. And that is a very difficult balancing act because, of course, the United States is speaking to one government with two different constituencies. And it becomes even harder to get the message right. And the takeaway from this is not for me to give you the right answer, because nobody knows the right answer. This is a process. But we will never reach a point where we deploy the exact right thing, or say the exact right words, or name the extended deterrent and strategic consultative group the exact right name. We used to have the extended deterrent dialogue, and then, it won't be at the right level. It'll simply be an ongoing process. And the extent to which that we are committed to that process and can have open, engaged, sustained dialogues will build more of that confidence. But you're never going to cross the finish line, because we're now, 60 years, 70 years past NATO being formed, and we're still engaged in that process. And it's just going to continue. So that's sort of an unsatisfying answer, but I think sets the baseline pretty well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jenny.
Great. Thanks, John, and thanks, Joel. It's great to be here. It's great to see people again, although now we can't see who's online, but it's a timely discussion. And as John mentioned, there's no way to fully reassure an ally. The capabilities are tangible and easy to understand, but the intent, as he says, is psychological. And it will be a process to try and reassure and to improve. So there's always going to be some doubts, but certainly in times of great uncertainty like what we have now, those doubts are going to be higher and need to be addressed in a much more visible manner. As Joel mentioned, over the past year, we conducted a study based on a bilateral US-South Korea Track 2 dialogue, where we looked at the current extended deterrence relationship and what could be done to better adapt our practices to the times. The underlying premise of all of this was that denuclearization is unlikely. North Korean denuclearization is unlikely to make any positive progress in the coming years. So what does North Korea's advancing program actually mean for extended deterrence? But that wasn't the only trend of concern as we were doing this study. Certainly increased US-China rivalry has sparked a regional arms race. We've seen, visible improvements across the board in terms of US, China, Russia, all in the process of nuclear modernization. But we've also seen South Korea developing new missiles, SLBMs, hypersonics. We've also seen Japan improving their missile capabilities and their drone capabilities. But we've also seen, as part of that rivalry, increasing minilateral security pacts in the region. So all of this is creating greater tensions while it's trying to address the regional security environment as a whole. The implications of that, though, are of course that this raises the risk of conflict when we have such high uncertainty, when we have such great tensions, and especially conflict over Taiwan. So there's a lot of fears in the region of what North Korea might do under those circumstances. If something happens in Taiwan, if something happens in the South China Seas, what might North Korea decide to do at that moment, whether it's a coordinated double attack, or if it's even just an opportunistic moment for the North Koreans. We've also seen, really a lot of implications coming out of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. John talked about some of them already, but it's really hard to tell the full impact that this has had on the global non-proliferation regime. For the first time in a long time, a nuclear weapon state has attacked a non-nuclear weapon state and has threatened to use nuclear weapons. They haven't yet, but even the threat of doing so calls into question the social contract and raises questions about what North Korea is learning from Russia's experience, and from that matter, from Ukraine's experience as well, and how that might embolden them in the future, especially as North Korea-Russia ties seemingly are growing. North Korea has said in its new law, some of the language is surprisingly echoing nuclear non-proliferation treaty language, that it won't threaten or attack non-nuclear weapon states with nuclear weapons. But it also considers South Korea and Japan nuclear by proxy because of US extended deterrence. and goes on to define a number of cases in which nuclear weapons could be used, including preemptively against imminent attacks to leadership or strategic assets, or if they think a nuclear attack is imminent, and then also if the conventional war isn't going well. So this obviously makes for a more dangerous situation. And as John said, it's not necessarily new information since they've been hinting at this for months now. But to see it in writing, including a plan to set off an automatic nuclear attack if the leadership is attacked, is concerning, especially to South Korea. What would it take for the US to use nuclear weapons? Where might the North Koreans target in a nuclear strike? And can South Korea really afford to absorb that? What is the strategy and plans for after nuclear use? And is the assumption that fighting will just stop? All of these scenarios are of heightened concern these days in the current geopolitical environment. So really, another trend is this real emphasis on ideological divides. And this creates a lot of political cover for the North Koreans, especially with the Chinese, as we've seen the result of the UN Security Council being paralyzed on North Korean issues. But also, as we see with, like I said, growing Russia and North Korea cooperation, especially in the military to military side, with Russia praising North Korea also for its loyal support, even while scolding China for their wavering. So while all of this does create new trilateral cooperation, not just because of the new administration in Seoul, but also greater concern about regional dynamics and the prospects for conflict, especially over Taiwan, or driven by North Korean aggression. We also always have to recognize the historical issues between Japan and Korea tend to get worse at times of domestic turmoil in either country. And we've already seen that Yoon is in a very vulnerable position domestically, and responses to things like Japanese, Kishida's cabinet members visiting Yakasuni Shrine are likely to exacerbate those relationships, even though everyone understands the collective benefits of cooperation. So some highlights of the report then that will be out later this week. We had a US ROC dialogue over the course of a year. There were 5 sessions. We made it scenario-based to look at what different alternative futures might look like. Different arrangements, such as a nuclear consultative process, of a process of consultation for nuclear use. We looked at deploying advanced weapons, conventional weapons in South Korea, how that might augment. We looked at scenarios where there were US nuclear weapons deployed to the region, but not on the peninsula, and deployed to the region on the peninsula. And we looked at potential Chinese responses to all of these things. Participants came from a diverse range of functional and regional expertise across a broad spectrum of political viewpoints, and included both senior level and emerging scholars with diverse backgrounds. And one of the seemingly easiest and I think most important recommendations to come out of the report was really that we really need to build a comprehensive and coordinated strategic communication strategy that engages stakeholders and the public in more frequent and specific ways surrounding alliance cooperation, coordination, and its evolution, to build greater confidence that the alliance is adapting to the changing conditions. So really, again, dealing with the psychological part of extended deterrence. So in the dialogue, it was very clear that those who had participated in extended deterrence consultations, like the EDSCG that John mentioned, these people were insistent that consultation is robust and ongoing. But it was very clear that there was very little awareness of what actually goes on, what that actually means, or what goes on in those meetings, and what's being done, especially after the meetings are over, from those of us in the security and defense policy communities who are meant to support these efforts, much less the general public. So at a time of heightened tensions, creating greater visibility into the current consultative process is badly needed, as there is reassurance in knowing that not only are the high-level meetings going on and are substantive and meaningful, but that there's also ongoing coordination and cooperation when the cameras go dark. This means, for one, making information about the consultative bodies and past achievements more accessible, such as a centralized website even about alliance coordination bodies, but also cultivating a more informed press corps about the various ways in which consultation cooperation take place. This includes press kits, short course training programs for reporters to cultivate deeper knowledge and more informed reporting, as well as coordinating messages between Washington and Seoul to avoid the appearance of cleavages in policy positions that can be exploited. A second recommendation is really to invest in long-term capacity building in South Korea, especially on nuclear policy and extended deterrence, engaging a wide range of policy analysts, opinion leaders, as well as emerging scholars through specialized in-person professional development and educational programs, as well as online courses and longer-term track 2 dialogues. This is obviously a long-term strategy, but will help build capacity over time, and if done right, can start building bilateral networks from an early age. But it also means increasing working level cooperation in the consultative process to help promote the institutionalization of knowledge. While high-level engagements are important, like what we see when we have the Korea Integrated Defense and Deterrence Dialogue, where it's a number of different meetings that happen over the course of a 1 or 2 day consultation, this puts a lot of pressure on the situation, cramming this number of important issues together, but especially in the organization and execution of it. So and people can get wrapped up though in the execution rather than in the substance. But it also gives the public impression that this is the only time these discussions happen. So creating joint studies and allowing for more flexible execution of meetings can help facilitate greater learning and exchange. It can feed recommendations into the higher level meetings to maximize their utility, but it can also demonstrate a sense of ongoing and constant cooperation. I think another important thing, given the new geopolitical concerns, is really to inject new and realistic scenarios into US-ROC joint military exercises and tabletop exercises to help identify vulnerabilities in areas needing improvement, exercising to failure. Wargaming and exercising to failure on both North Korea specific and broader regional conflict can reveal where the current capabilities and protocols need to be bolstered, where concerns are, especially in the case of a 2-front conflict, and getting force flows from Japan if there's other conflict going on in the region, and be better prepared for a whole range of contingencies. I think running these at an unclassed level will also be important in also assuring that these issues are of concern and are being addressed within the alliance. Certainly an investment in South Korean conventional force capabilities to deter and defend against North Korea's growing capabilities is important, especially in areas designed to directly take away North Korea's strategic and military advantages, such as the hypersonic cruise missiles and major enhancements to South Korea's intelligence and surveillance technologies. And long-range precision strike capabilities. The alliance should also prioritize communication system connectivity and integration, especially command, control, and communication. Obviously, supplementing these with US advanced conventional capabilities will also be useful, such as drones and long-range precision strike capabilities. Literal combat ships and unmanned underwater vehicles could also be useful to help with surface warfare, countermine operations, and maritime domain awareness. But this last part, though, is likely to be criticized by China as playing into an encirclement campaign. And as we saw, China demonstrate both its will and ability to inflict hardship on South Korea for decisions it considered against its national interests in the past. Building an alliance support and response strategy in the case of Chinese economic coercion that utilizes all aspects of state power and galvanizes a collective response among like-minded states is also important. So as US-China competition intensifies, China is likely to view changes to the US-ROC alliance posture and deployments with great suspicion and act in a similar manner to what they did before, if not more pronounced. And so a coordinated alliance response plan may help to prevent coercive actions if executed and communicated in advance, or can at least help mitigate their effects. So I think, there's two kind of bottom lines here. One is we really need to better understand where the threshold is between improving capabilities and cooperation and further agitating the strategic environment. But we also need to understand that with all of the regional and global security trends moving in the wrong direction right now, this will also affect our ability to engage North Korea. So yes, North Korea's advancements in its WMD programs contribute to regional tensions, but trying to convince North Korea in the middle of this to limit its arms or come back to talks about denuclearization will require the regional security situation to move in a more positive direction first, as it's not a very compelling proposition for North Korea to be the only one to voluntarily disarm while the rest of the region is arming up. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Annie. So there's a lot to talk about. What I'd like to do is focus on sort of the bird's eye view of things. I think many of the things that Jenny has outlined are extremely important, and I see them as useful, but they're sort of near-term remedies. But without a change in the evolving security environment in the region, as John said, this is a process. But the issue is, I think, at what point does the process not work anymore? At what point does it break down, and then what? So I'd also like to get into that. And at least my bigger theme is that, over the decades, people have talked about how it's important to have a nuclear-free Northeast Asia. What I would say is now we're on the slow motion road to a nuclearized Northeast Asia. And so the issue for US policymakers, for South Korean policymakers, Japan, maybe even China, is do we want that to happen? How might we avoid that? So the first thing I'd like to talk about is not so much the consultative process. I think that's pretty straightforward, but what are some steps that might be taken to really reinforce what we're saying? And by that, I mean not just taking South Koreans to go visit a nuclear submarine or to look at a nuclear bomber. And I don't mean at the other extreme, redeploying nuclear weapons to a region, but one of the issues to me is very interesting and important is the issue of these advanced conventional technologies and how it might reinforce deterrence, because deterrence is not and hasn't been for a while just reliant on nuclear weapons. I think that's another thing that people need to understand, that they probably don't. Most people probably don't. So let me turn it, I guess, John and then Jenny. John, you understand a lot of these new conventional technologies, and how might they help reinforce deterrence, extended deterrence?
So it's a good question, but there are two separate questions there, right? So part of this, as I mentioned, is how confident is South Korea that we are so closely tied together, that our militaries are so integral, and that we are so committed that we will be able to withstand and respond to any North Korean attack. That's a political process. And so when there is a capability, like, for example, South Korea would like to develop missiles in excess of 180 miles in range, and we say, no, you can't do that. It raises doubts about, well, if you don't even let us build missiles, how do we know that you're going to go to war with us? And so there's a rationale behind some of the decisions that are made within the United States government about the defense relationship. But that's a political one. The question of what capabilities effectively deter North Korea, you could make a very strong argument that North Korea is effectively deterred today as a result of the fact that since 1951, we've not seen a large-scale conventional military attack, nor have we seen a nuclear attack. This is the same argument that you could make effectively with regards to NATO and NATO territory and the Soviet Union and Russia. But it assumes that if there is a gap in our deterrent capability, that North Korea, or in that case, the Soviet Union, was ready to attack the next minute. And you never know that for sure. You're assuming the worst case about your potential adversary. You're discounting crisis stability and instability and just saying, on a Monday, if we don't deploy this, will North Korea be so emboldened and aggressive that they decide to stream across the border? Some people assume that and some people don't. But the question of whether or not we could effectively destroy North Korea's military capability, how quickly would we be able to withstand and counter a nuclear attack? Those are very complicated conventional force on force and nuclear force on force calculations, which are at the heart of the extended deterrent dialogues, but clearly work to the advantage of the United States and South Korea over time. What do I mean by that? On day one, can North Korea attack and do tremendous damage? You bet. That's been true since before they crossed the nuclear threshold in the 2000s because they had artillery within range of Seoul, where half the population of South Korea lives. That's something that South Koreans have grown up with and maybe not become happy with, but at least accustomed to. In a month, would North Korea be destroyed? Absolutely. Within 2 weeks? Probably. But the ability of the United States to use and South Korea to use advanced conventional capabilities, improved ISR, space assets to the extent that North Korea is reliant on satellite communications, that gets better over time. And remarkably, even if you look at the growth in North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities, I don't think any informed military analyst would tell you that North Korea is in a better position across the board than the United States or South Korea today than they were 20 years ago. The advancements in the United States and South Korea's advanced conventional warfighting communication capability outstrip anything that the North Koreans have been able to invest in. Can they produce a lot of artillery shells that can be shipped to Russia? Yes. But precise capabilities, tracking, intelligence is something that they simply can't match. So it's a complicated scenario, Joel, and I think that's unsatisfying.
Yeah, no, and I don't want to mislead people. Look, this is psychological, right? I mean, there's no one in North Korea who thinks they won't be wiped out if they attack South Korea with nuclear weapons. I'm sure of that. But deterrence is a psychological game, right? So the issue is, can you affect psychology by deploying more advanced conventional weapons as opposed to nuclear weapons, which obviously have a greater psychological impact? And part of the psychology, of course, is how effective weapons are perceived as being. So if you tell me you're going to fire an artillery shell at me that's going to kill me versus fire a nuclear weapon at me, which is going to kill me and 100,000 other people who might be in my vicinity, they're two different things. So I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. You know, hypersonic missiles sound great, you know, wow, really new technology, but are they going to have a psychological impact? Or you can't predict it, but could they have a psychological impact, not just in North Korea, but South Korea?
I think the answer is probably yes and no. In terms of, yes, they understand, in South Korea, they really understand the value of more advanced conventional weapons, and it is something that they're in pursuit of, have plans for, want more of. I agree with John in the sense that, you know, I think North Korea is effectively deterred from an actual attack. Will advanced conventional weapons, a buildup of advanced conventional weapons, dissuade North Korea from lower level provocations? I think is an open question, right? And unfortunately, a question that's even more complicated than actual deterrence. Because, you know, again, the psychology of it, if you look at what happened in 2010, there was great restraint shown to the attack on Yeonpyeong Island, the shelling of Yeonpyeong Island, and the sinking of the Cheonan. If that's their calculation, including more advanced conventional capabilities might not change that. However, I think Washington's willingness to show restraint has evolved since then. And I don't know that that's necessarily been factored into North Korean calculations. But I think the bigger question then is, even if it has a reassurance effect and a deterrent effect for South Korea, North Korea, The question is how does China perceive these actions? And will it be, again, more agitating to the situation as a whole and to regional security as a whole, and to South Korea, China's perceptions of South Korea beyond the North Korea issue. And that is highly likely, I think,
Joel,
scenario.
I'm sorry, just one last point. You know, look, it could come down to how do we forestall redeploying nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula or South Korea building their own. And in that context, does the deployment of more advanced conventional weapons help forestall that? Maybe not permanently, but maybe in the near term.
So 2 points building off what Jenny said, and I think hopefully answering your question, Joel. The first is there are 2 different concepts that are often conflated here between deterrence and compellence, or deterrence and dissuasion. They're very different things. Nuclear weapons can be very good at deterrence. They are lousy at compellence. You can't say, I have nuclear weapons, therefore you have to do everything I say. It tends not to work, and it definitely doesn't work over the long term. So we just have to be careful about the conflation. The answer to your question, Joel, is it depends on what South Korea is trying to do and what they think nuclear weapons will do for them. If it is about the ability to defeat North Korea in an attack and deter them, the nuclear weapons, I would argue, on South Korean territory or in the possession of the South Korean governments are largely irrelevant. From an actual force-on-force destruction capability, survival capability, they're not necessary, and in fact, they make things more complicated, particularly with regards to China, but also with regards to North Korea. So the question I always ask my South Korean friends are, what is the gap you're trying to fill? Is it a particular military capability, a precision capability, a wide-set destruction capability, and electromagnetic pulse generation to short out electronic signals capability? And the answer I always get back is it's about matching North Korea's position. It's about the credibility and the power and the, I won't say credibility, but the authority that they believe they gain from having nuclear weapons, and we don't have that same thing. And so I would argue that the redeployment of US nuclear weapons in South Korea are also largely irrelevant for that, except to the extent that they allow the South Korean political process to scratch an itch that would otherwise only be scratched by developing their own nuclear capability.
And I just think that, you know, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this concept, again, that only nuclear deters nuclear is more, has been revived in the region. It is much more pronounced than it has been in the past, where it does get to this point where, you know, adding new weapons, advanced conventional capabilities is good, but it still won't prevent North Korea from using nuclear weapons. And so there's this growing attitude that only nuclear will deter nuclear, only nuclear will keep North Korea from using nuclear weapons, and a greater push for a South Korean command and control capability rather than US command and control. So you know, I think the answer here is we're not sure.
But the answer also is what you're saying basically is that if we continue down this road with these bad trends, there's no way of avoiding South Korea from either somehow getting us to deploy nuclear weapons in the region or even building their own, because they need to scratch that itch. And let me add one other thing. We will never give South Korea any say in terms of when the button is ready to be pressed. We need their approval. So they're not going to have that kind of control. It's never going to happen.
Right.
So we're in this spot then. We're basically in a spot where there are no substitutes. And that's what I was sort of driving at.
Mm.
Can you convince people that, you know, these really advanced conventional weapons could serve as something of a substitute for nuclear weapons?
So I don't know that I agree with everything you just said, Joel. I'd never say never. I think it's very unlikely that a US president will say, I'll only use nuclear weapons if you say it's okay. But there are a lot of steps the United States can take in terms of integrating South Korean thinking and decision-making into US nuclear command and control. Because I do think the United States, at least for the foreseeable future, will care so much about the US-South Korean alliance, particularly as it comes to dealing with the challenge of China, that we're prepared to bend a lot of old pillars, if necessary, in order to keep the alliance strong and vital. And a lot of people in the nuclear community for many years have talked about the risk or the possibility that South Korea might go nuclear, not as a decision point, but as a rheostat. That the more they talk about it, it's more of a symbol and a surrogate for saying we're concerned about the depth of the relationship. But I don't think anybody would tell you, and nobody should tell you, that it's impossible that some future North Korean leader will say, I need this. I need this politically, or I need it militarily, or I need it strategically. Sorry, South Korea, thank you. It's an old problem. And I don't know how a particular US president will react at that time, but I assume that the reaction will be, well, let's try all of these things first. Because one basic premise of the United States throughout the nuclear age has been, we are in a better, more stable, more secure, and also, by the way, a more powerful position, the fewer nuclear weapon states there are in the world, and the longer our allies remain non-nuclear as part of our extended deterrent relationship.
Yeah, no, I agree with you that you could envision a future circumstance where the situation would become such that, it would be very clear that we had reached a decision. That either the US had to do this, and this, which it would never do before, or the consequences would be very bad. So that's quite possible. I don't discount that. And indeed, that's one of the things we want to try to do in this discussion is to look forward to that particular point in time. But I guess the short-term point is, look, nuclear weapons, nothing's going to avoid this sort of nuclear fix. There aren't other technologies that are going to sort of wean us off our fix. I mean, that's pretty much what you're saying. And I don't disagree with that. I was just wondering whether, there were some that might at least help.
Yeah.
And I think that the situation gets trickier even, we're assuming right now that, the trends are moving in all the wrong directions, but the US-ROC alliance is strong. And I know there's a lot of growing concern in South Korea as to who the next US president is going to be if we get another, president that's sort of antagonistic towards alliances as Trump was, and what that might look like could be very different than what we saw 4 years ago when people were kind of in shock and willing to wait and see what happens. So, if the trends continue down that road, yes, we're still going to be talking about nuclear weapons in South Korea much more than we have in recent years, but the probability of actual movement and decisions being made gets higher if the US-ROC alliance gets weaker.
Yeah, right. It would accelerate. If 2 years from now, Donald Trump, in the worst case scenario, 2 years from now, Donald Trump was reelected and got his, wish list of withdrawing troops from Northeast Asia, that would be a real crunch point. I don't know what would happen then, but certainly it's something that would, it's a crunch point that could happen very soon. And all of this discussion would be sort of moot. Anyway, okay, well, we've settled that issue. There are a lot of other issues here. One of the big issues here, maybe I should save this for last, is when you're trying to, if you were a US decision maker, some of us have been in the government, you understand the relationships between all these different things, right? There's the developing regional security situation. There's your relationships with your allies. how those are developing. Your relationships with your enemies, how those are developing. And how do you construct a policy that can deal with these issues and avoid the worst case scenarios? And I think here, the worst case scenarios they're pretty clear. So part of connecting all these dots is diplomacy. I mean, it's probably a lost art in the United States, but diplomacy should be part of connecting these dots. And the issue is, what kind of diplomatic strategy should we pursue towards these other countries? And I don't want to get into a long discussion of China, but certainly North Korea. And I think we've been saying this for a while, Jenny has, I have, is that we need to just reevaluate our diplomatic strategy towards North Korea. And quite frankly, I think we need to admit defeat. That 30 years haven't worked of engagement. I'm not going to get into who's to blame, but it's clear that at this point, particularly after Friday, it hasn't worked. So what would a new strategy look like? I mean, are there any things that could be done to at least avoid heightened tensions in the region, maybe to lessen tensions? Is there anything that could be done in the region to deal with this situation before it gets out of hand? And I just want to add one other point. I understand in Europe, deterrence has worked for a long time, but Korean Peninsula is a different ballgame. Because 2010, 2015, some people would argue 2017, things got really hairy. And so, you just need to sort of throw that into the mix, that this is not really Europe. It's a situation that is less stable, even in the best of
So I won't do a comparative historical analysis between Europe and South Korea, but somebody and the Korean Peninsula, but if somebody who did their graduate thesis work on the Berlin crisis.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I mean,
Yeah.
before the end of the Cold War, I mean, in the past 10 years.
Oh, well, that's a blink of an eye. Bill, yeah.
Cold War, what?
Yeah, no, but I think the point, I think the point is that it's never either or, right? You're never relying purely on a military strategy or a diplomatic strategy or an economic geopolitical strategy, right? All of these things are playing at once. And of course, in the United States government, and they're playing in a very uncoordinated fashion because we have our cylinders of excellence that rarely sort of cross-fertilize. What I would say, Joel, is I'm not a proponent for accepting defeat. I think there are still a large number of benefits to maintaining a position where we refuse to accept or acknowledge North Korea as a nuclear weapons state. I think that's still beneficial both in terms of our relationship with South Korea. It's beneficial in our relationship with Japan. It's beneficial in our relationship with China. And I think it has benefits for the non-proliferation regime. Not forever and not no matter what, but I still think that it's not an easy, okay, just say it didn't work and move on. Where I think we have to recognize, however, is where the challenge really comes in, we have to recognize is, if you project forward, as I know your projects are looking at 10, 15, 20 years, what will the North Korean nuclear capability look like? And what will that mean for the nature of the US presence in the region? And you can see different futures. Just as if we had made certain decisions in 1988 or 1998 with regard to Pakistan, and say, are there things we can do to redirect different futures in terms of the growth of their nuclear capability? Then I think you probably would have made some very different decisions. Whereas now in Pakistan, you see battlefield nuclear weapons and talk about nuclear landmines and short-range nuclear artillery shells. Those are things that pose serious problems for command and control, crisis stability, that you really wish you had made some decisions differently 20, 30 years ago. So that's where I think the diplomatic angle comes in. Can you have engagement with North Korea, and can you do bank shot engagement through others that convince North Korea that there are compromises to be made, short of full denuclearization and step-by-step denuclearization. I don't know that your prospects there are much better than full-on nuclear denuclearization, but I think there is benefit both in terms of managing the alliance and in potential progress in North Korea that are worth trying. But who does that and how, I think, remains, to state the obvious, very complicated, and I don't have the answer for that.
Yeah, no, you're entirely right. So there are ways of finessing defeat. You know, we're not gonna.
We've been doing that for a while.
President Biden isn't gonna go out and say, gee, forget about denuclearization of North Korea. We recognize you as a nuclear state. That's not gonna happen. But on the other hand, clinging to the idea that that's the be all and end all of your policy, which I think we do,
Right.
That's not gonna happen. So you can figure out ways of dealing with that. But you're absolutely right, that it's hard to conceive of what kind of diplomatic strategy might work with North Korea at this point. I mean, it definitely needs more thought. But I like your analogy to Pakistan too, because, 10 years from now, when we're looking back at Northeast Asia and wherever we are, maybe even in Northeast Asia where everyone has nuclear weapons, we may think, gee, we really blew it. We should have done something else. So it's definitely worth starting to think about now.
I would say, one thing that will be really important for the prospects of diplomacy going forward is South Korea stopping talk about their kill chain. And they're having a preemptive doctrine as well, because I think this is very damaging to inter-Korean relations. It's obviously has a huge impact on US DPRK relations. It's one thing for the US to say we have no hostile intent. But then if you have South Korea on the other hand talking about kill chain and massive punishment and blah, 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 it doesn't, the no hostile intent doesn't resonate very well. And I think, some of what we're seeing in North Korea's nuclear doctrine is in response to, this resurgence of preemptive doctrine in South Korea. So I think that's going to be really important. But I agree with Joel in that we need to move away from this sort of denuclearization centered approach to North Korea, because we're not going to get there until we deal with some of the larger strategic security trends that are going on. And I look to, there's only really one example of a state that had built their own nuclear weapons and voluntarily gave them up, and that's South Africa. And I think there are kind of lessons to be learned there as to what factored into their calculus of actually giving up nuclear weapons. And certainly they only had 7 or 8. So it's a much different scale than what we're dealing with here. But, part of the decision making was, that de Klerk himself was anti-nuclear weapons. They had a change of leadership. But part of it was also that the threat that, really triggered the development of nuclear weapons, of Soviet expansionism in Africa, had fell away after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so, if we're talking about North Korea and we're talking about what might incentivize them to change their stance on, nuclear weapons, I think we do need to look at the underlying security situation to say, this idea that, denuclearize or else is not a very compelling stance. Whereas if the security situation starts to get better, and in times when we've had a political situation that was more conducive to negotiations and more conducive to concessions, we have seen progress in those areas. But I don't think we get back there now until, the US-China rivalry gets under control, until, the war in Ukraine is over, until we kind of move away from this Cold War resurgence anyway. And so, if all of these trends continue in that direction, I think it's going to be very difficult to pull North Korea out of that mix.
Another thing that's going on in Middle Denny is able to comment on this. It's interesting, you brought up the whole, South Korea talking about the kill chain and massive retaliation. I'd like to be the person who comes up with these labels. They seem to become more and more threatening, and the theory that you get more deterrence out of them. But on the other hand, there have been some signs that the new South Korean government is somewhat surprising in terms of its initiatives towards North Korea, and particularly talking about having the more normal relations even before North Korea does anything on the nuclear front. And I assume that means the United States should pursue more normal relations, which is quite a change from past conservative governments. So I'm wondering if you have any insights about what's going on there. What's the dynamic behind it?
Well, I don't think the policy is necessarily before North Korea does anything on denuclearization. I think there is still the conditional there that the goal is for North Korea to go down a denuclearization path, and that there's benefits to doing so, and trying to lay out what some of those tangible benefits might be.
But then correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, yes, they're not saying forget about denuclearization, let's have normal relations. But the idea, or at least my impression is the idea of doing something on that front before getting an actual nuclear move from North Korea is something different.
Like I said, I'm not sure that that's necessarily what they're saying of the sequencing and timing of it. I think the question is whether the move happens or whether they've committed to doing something. The commitment has to definitely be there as part of improving relations. And the package that they're proposing, this audacious plan, is not much different from what Lee Myung-bak had. And this is also, the North Koreans have recognized this and have criticized this as well, of, some of this is repackaging with a new label, a more positive label than what it was in the past. But, I think the underlying problem here is that South Korea doesn't have the leverage to deal with North Korea's nuclear program. So they still want nuclear concessions as part of a inter-Korea process, but they're, the only leverage they have is economic and social. And the North Koreans have never been very open to that kind of exchange, because they want, to deal with equals. They want to deal with security issues as well, and something more substantive than just trade, even though trade is an important part of what would be beneficial to them from a denuclearization process.
There's a way to knit these two things together, Joel, your previous question, and Jenny's really good response here, which is, what do we want from North Korea? We want them not to have nuclear weapons. That would be a preferred end state. Are there things short of them not having nuclear weapons that would improve the security situation for South Korea, the United States, and arguably for North Korea? And we can't really get our heads into the North Korean heads, but you could say, yes, there are things in terms of crisis stability, crisis communications, confidence building that stop well short of North Korea denuclearizing, and you could argue even well short of them no longer producing more nuclear weapons, that would improve the security situation and the calculation for the South and the United States. Is that establish crisis communications with the North and the South in a more reliable, effective way than we have today? Is it norms for operating at sea among U.S., South Korean, and North Korean ships in a way we don't have today? Is it communications for dealing with interaction between air forces, right? There are a number of things you can think of that would be beneficial, that would reduce the risk of crisis instability and escalation that we might like to get, and that might be tied in part to what the South Koreans might be willing to do in terms of economic incentives and normalization. I think the South Koreans have much more flexibility than they've had in the past to undertake a number of these initiatives with the North, because for the United States, there's no confidence that North Korea is about to be denuclearized, and because they want to ensure that South Korea and the United States are in lockstep with regards to China. And so politically, what's necessary for the Yun government is, I think, more acceptable for the United States, depending on what they want to achieve. What we haven't seen, at least in some of the speeches that have come out from the government, is what exactly are they trying to achieve? What's the staging? As you said, Jenny, it's not, okay, you go first on nuclear and then we'll do this. It's simply the start of that process. And that's part of what, again, also has to happen, maybe not in part of the extended deterrent dialogue, but as part of the broader integration with the US and South Korea diplomatically, is what is it we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, no, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. You know, it's obvious that the main area of attention is tension reduction, escalation control, crisis stability. Those are the things that we should be focusing on now, not whether North Korea freezes Yonbyon or not, or gets another, you know, stops uranium enrichment at some other place. So that's the agenda. I mean, that's sort of the new agenda that no one has quite arrived at yet. Although the Yoon government has not ditched the comprehensive military agreement, I guess, the last I heard. So maybe they're also understanding that, you know, maybe we need to focus on confidence building.
Shane is on the line.
Shane's on the line. So, Shane has, he's done a big study in the past year on North Korean command and control of their nuclear deterrent. So I wanted to get his views on what happened Friday. Are you on the line, Shane?
You might also explain to other people who Shane is. And where he is.
Shane works at the Air Force Academy and he was at NDU and he's worked in the Pentagon on Northeast Asia.
Shane Smith.
Okay, so Shane isn't on the line.
Shane, can you hear us?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Sorry, I just was able to join in. I can't get my video to work yet. I don't mean to be disruptive to the conversation you were having about extended deterrence and especially about South Korea's growing capabilities. I thought that was really interesting. But with regard to the law that was promulgated by the Supreme People's Assembly last week, I think it's portends a pretty significant and disturbing new direction for North Korea's nuclear strategy. I think what everyone has, the media has really focused in on is the indicating that North Korea's nuclear program is not reversible, which is important, but I didn't really think of that as signifying much new given what North Korea and Kim Jong-un has said in the past. It did codify the right to use nuclear weapons preemptively. Again, I think important, but not necessarily anything substantially different than what we've been hearing and seeing from North Korea for years. In my mind, what was really interesting was the attention that the law placed on nuclear command and control related issues, because this really signifies and continuing attention and increased importance that North Korea places on operationalizing its nuclear capabilities, as opposed to just committing to developing more capabilities down the line. And to me, this is shows again a great deal of seriousness with which it is putting and attributing to operationalizing its nuclear strategy. I think a couple of things really stuck out to me. One is that this line in its law that says nuclear forces of the DPRK shall obey the monolithic command of the president of the state affairs of the DPRK, which is Kim Jong-un. I mean, a couple of things I took from that statement is one, the language from the 2013 law on consolidating a nuclear weapons state, which emphasized the role of the Korean People's Army and the Supreme Commander. That seems to be gone in this new updated law, where the emphasis on command and control is placed in the state affairs and in Kim Jong-un's leadership of that organization. And in fact, there was little to no mention of a role for the Korean People's Army in the command structure highlighted within the new law. But the other thing that really struck me about the language in the new document is that I was anticipating after studying North Korea's nuclear command and control arrangements and the direction that it might be going in over the last 18 months was that I kind of anticipated that this law would include language justifying or building some kind of narrative for delegating launch authority, right? We saw earlier this summer where North Korea was talking about forward deploying, so-called tactical nuclear weapons to frontline units. Well, I kind of thought that that language in this law might bolster that by providing the justification for delegating launch authority to those frontline units, but it didn't. It reemphasized language that was in the 2013 law, saying that Kim Jong-un has sole release authority over nuclear weapons, and because of that, I think it shows that there are still limitations within North Korea and its ability to adopt a so-called warfighting nuclear strategy that would enable iterative, limited nuclear attacks during a conflict, which would require some level of delegated authority, because Kim Jong-un couldn't expect to maintain situational awareness in a fast-moving nuclear conflict in order to issue attack orders and expect to be effective in doing so. So there would need to be some level of delegation, and that's where I didn't see that language in this new law that came out on Friday, and I think surprising to given my expectations. But in fact, there was some language therein talking about having some automaticity built into its command structure, right? When I think the language was, in case of command and control system over the state nuclear forces is placed in danger owing to an attack by hostile forces, a nuclear strike shall be launched automatically and immediately. I think that's really interesting. It isn't quite clear what that kind of automatic kind of command structure might entail. But the law also included some indication that others within the state affairs may have some level of authority over those launch decisions. I think the sentence that comes to my mind is when it says the State Nuclear Forces Command Organization, composed of members appointed by the President of the State Affairs of the DPRK, shall assist the President of State Affairs in the whole course of decision concerning nuclear weapons to execution. I mean, this suggests that he's looking to others within to help execute his nuclear strategy and employment of nuclear weapons if need be. So maybe there will be redundant command centers within North Korea so that if something happens to Kim Jong-un, that others could step into his shoes and maintain operational authority over nuclear forces. And of course, Kim's sister and Cho Ryong-hae are both within the State Affairs organization. And so they've long been thought to be people who could or might be being groomed to be second in line, if you will, if something happened to Kim. So to me, I think these are really fascinating and profoundly important developments in understanding and underscoring the direction in which North Korea is looking to build its nuclear strategy and how it is thinking about operationalizing them.
Thanks, Shane.
Over. Yeah.
Maybe we should save some time. Does anyone have questions either online or here? We have a few hands here. I don't know about online. So why don't we start with people here, starting with this woman right here?
Thank you. I'm Diane Perlman. I just spent the last month at the UN at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, and I was representing civil society, specifically Transcend International and also Mediators Beyond Borders. In the past, I have Psychologists for Social Responsibility. And Joe, I appreciate your comments about need for tension reduction and diplomacy and confidence building measures. And also I am a psychologist, a clinical and political psychologist, actually. And the reason that we have to go to graduate school and get training and write a dissertation is because using common sense and being righteous and reasonable usually makes things worse. And there's also like the law of opposites and how acting according to deterrence theory can provoke spiral theory, like Jervis's work. And I had several conversations with Michael Crapon, and he was very tuned into this. And I just want to mention, I started as a speaker in the 1980s for Physicians for Social Responsibility on the psychology of the arms race and the image of the enemy and the psychology of enemies. And there was like a huge, rich body of knowledge, very creative, productive in the 80s that is all but lost now. And in particular, I mean, Jervis is in there and Robert J. Lifton and many people that many of us know. And there's a volume by Ralph K. White, who was a social psychologist and also a mentor of mine. And he had this book, Psychology and the Prevention of Nuclear War. He had another one on fearful warriors. But one thing he said is that deterrence only works if there is drastic tension reduction. And an organizing principle is reducing tension. And also that people are more dangerous when afraid. And we're also more dangerous when we're afraid. And, things like humiliation and backing into a corner and the sort of this worldview of, us, them, black and white, like concrete thinking. And there was also, there's a theory some of you may know called grit by Charles Osgood, which is graduated reciprocated initiatives in tension reduction, where one side takes a unilateral move to do something to reduce tension, and then you wait to see if the other side reciprocates. So you don't lose anything. You don't, let down your guard and become vulnerable. And if they don't respond, you can also go back up. And it's a way of ratcheting down the arms race. And, just in the past, things like the sunshine policy and even the Olympics, like giving a face-saving way out. But there are bodies of knowledge in interdisciplinary social science on conflict transformation that are really like completely either unknown or misunderstood. And they exist and we can call upon that. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess John and well, certainly I go far enough back to, we know about those books, which are lost, you're right. But,
I'm trying. I got the right from Ralph's son.
Yeah, and it does apply here because there's, as Jenny mentioned before, why South Korea should stop talking about the kill chain. I mean, you understand why they do that. Of course, they're trying to reinforce deterrence, but when do your public statements go over the line? You're not just reinforcing deterrence. You're in many ways undermining it because you're being provocative. That's something that's really tough to figure out.
Hi, I'm Flo Cantlon. I'm from the Australian Embassy. I was really interested in, right at the beginning, you broke down extended deterrence to be about reassuring allies, but also about deterring the aggressor. The conversation was really interesting. I think it focused a lot more on the former, and I just wondered whether there's been consideration into how, what exactly we're trying to deter North Korea from here, and whether their goals have changed now that they have achieved a nuclear capability. Like, what are we assuming that their goals are quite expansive, where they may be limited, and whether we should be focusing on what they actually want in order to then calibrate US extended deterrence in the region?
It's a really good question, and it gives me a chance to go back to a point from the discussion earlier I didn't get to. So we don't have very deep knowledge about the innermost thinkings of Kim Jong-un and leadership. I often joke that we don't know what they have for breakfast, so we can't possibly know what their deepest insecurity challenges are. But if you look at the long sweep of their nuclear evolution, which Joel, Jenny, and I have, you can see a clear link between regime survival, territorial integrity, and nuclear weapons. That those are sort of three pillars of that stool. US strategy and South Korean strategy has been designed to protect South Korean territorial integrity and freedom from aggression. You can argue very effectively that we've done a good job at the top level, wide-scale military aggression from the North. But that brings in the security-insecurity paradox, which has been written about a lot in nuclear theory, which is that you may deter very effectively at the top end kinetic, but that means it may make the world safe for small-scale incursions, cyber, lower level gray zone problems, which nuclear weapons are not very well suited to deal with and are not capable of deterring. Because it's not credible, as Joel was talking about, that you're going to kill a couple of million people in Pyongyang because the North Koreans shell an island across the line of control. And so you need to have this full range of capabilities. And I think that gets to the point about advanced conventional capabilities, improved ISR, improved intelligence to understand North Korean motives. And I would argue, and this is a big part of what I spent my time in government looking at, what are the non-military ways that you can influence and, if necessary, deter North Korea? One of the most effective things we've ever done with North Korea was seizing assets of the BDA, which was a $25 million bank account, but showed that we knew how North Korea was moving money and opened up the entire next generation of sanctions enforcement that made it much harder for North Korea to do what they had been doing. That's moved into different areas now, whether it's, cyber extortion or cryptocurrency flows, but that avenue, I think, is just as effective, and I would argue more credible than a lot of things that go on at the nuclear level. But it does start with understanding what it is you're trying to deter and having some agreement among allies about that. And that's part of the challenge and part of what has to be at the core of the extended deterrence discussion.
And I think just to add to that, the other underlying tension here is whether or not North Korea is trying to reunify the peninsula by force. And I think the North Koreans have the same concerns, whether South Korea is trying to reunify the peninsula by force. And so that ongoing tension, really does create that paranoia. Yes, we're trying to deter kinetic attack, but that's sort of the rationale of why they would attack. I think the question is always, is that really North Korea's goal? And I think that's an ongoing debate. There's no consensus on this. There's still a lot of lingering paranoia that it is. I think there's plenty of science to show that it likely is not. But it is, you plan for capabilities, you plan for intentions. Whether or not that ends up being true is sort of, a wait and see, but you don't want to get caught off guard.
Yeah, I get your point. I just like that. I guess my concern, and I but I
I'm a former North Korea counterproliferation analyst. So I'm pretty familiar with a lot of these dynamics, but I guess my concern is if we are assuming, I know you have to defend against the possibility that North Korea may wish to reunify the peninsula, but I just haven't seen any indication of that, like we saw with Putin ahead of Ukraine and things like that, those kind of like long documents from the leadership espousing the great dream of reunifying the peninsula and stuff. You don't see that as much. And so I guess my concern is a lot of the things that we're doing to deter North Korea is actually just feeding into that paranoia that they have to defend against the external world, like these things like sanctions and stopping them from making money any which way we possibly can, kind of feeds into that paranoia and makes them feel more unstable and reinforces the need for them to continue to build up their nuclear arsenal.
I think this gets to a point Jenny made, and she can make it better herself, but it is, you want to make sure that the things you're doing to defend yourself, even in the worst case scenario, don't create that very scenario itself. That being said, there've been a couple of things said here I just want to disassociate myself with a little bit, which is North Korea wants nuclear weapons because they want nuclear weapons, right? There have been a number of opportunities and off-ramps and steps by the United States and South Korea and others to give North Korea a viable pathway dating back before the agreed framework, where if they did not want to be a nuclear weapon state and they wanted to find an alternative path to security, they could have pursued that. They chose not to for a number of reasons, and I don't necessarily fault them, but I think we have to recognize that those things are real and that their behavior and activities are not only dangerous to South Korea and the United States, but a violation of UN Security Council resolutions and international law, and are a driver of proliferation in the region. So let's put all those things aside for a second and say, yeah, let's make sure the things we do in response to that, like talk about kill chains, don't actually make us less secure. And that's something that politicians with a nice P, not a bad P, and political leaders are not always great at. Because when given the choice between let's make a step towards de-escalation and let's protect ourselves to make sure that if there's a crisis, we don't get blamed, they tend to side for the worst case analysis. And that's true in multiple countries, in multiple parties, across decades. And it's just a challenge of the international security dynamic.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. We don't need to get into a discussion of 30 years of history about diplomacy.
Then why are we here, Joel?
But I think the history is a little more complicated. Does anyone else have a question? This woman over here.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating discussion. First, let me say I am not pro-proliferation, but I just want to explore further the idea of South Korea getting nuclear weapons. I think it's more than just scratching an itch. It could be a way to lead to better diplomacy, actually, by gaining these weapons. There is a credible stick that will be existing to prod North Korea to choose the other path towards de-escalation, denuclearization, and economic development. And Kim Jong-un has plainly stated that that's one of his goals. In Byungjan, that's what he wanted, but he hasn't been able to do that. And obviously he cares more about nuclear weapons than opening up for economic development. But if in our efforts over these 30 years to do both carrots and sticks, and the stick has been sanctions, obviously that hasn't worked that well. So maybe the new stick should be a nuclearized South Korea, with the aim of having then arms control talks where both parties reduce their nuclear capability, and hopefully it even leads to economic development for North Korea. So what about that?
You know, if you're looking down the road 5 to 10 years, I think that's a definite possibility, right? If you were going to do an academic exercise, look down the road 5 years, whatever. And South Korea decides it wants nuclear weapons. How does that, what's the impact of that? Would the US say to South Korea, no way? And I think we might not say, no way. So if South Korea got nuclear weapons, what would be the impact? Would it be a stabilizing impact or a destabilizing impact? And, you know, people have done studies on this in the past, like Ken Waltz, who was a big American academic, you know, did work on maybe nuclear weapons are stabilizing. So it's certainly something to think about. And it may even be something that is more likely today than it was a few years ago.
I would just add that I think there's, you know, one assumption is it could lead to arms control talks. The other assumption is that it normalizes nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula and that you'll never get rid of nuclear weapons in either North or South once South gets nuclear weapons. Then the question becomes, what does Japan do? And so forth and down the line. So I, you know, we are definitely moving in that direction in the way that strategic trends are moving now. But, you know, certainly in South Korea, they also recognize that even the reintroduction of US tactical nuclear weapons and the development of nuclear weapons in South Korea would basically solidify North Korea's nuclear program and solidify nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula.
Not to pile on, I mean, my DNA was formed on the basis of, you know, original American nuclear thinking, which is the more nuclear weapon states there are, the more likely these weapons get used. And so I just have a natural reflexive opposition to proliferation by allies or adversaries. I've never seen a case of a country getting nuclear weapons that didn't drive nuclear interest by others. So I worry a lot about the spread beyond South Korea. Once one major US ally decides to go nuclear, others will be increasingly interested. So there's a challenge there. And the second is, if the argument is that South Korea having nuclear weapons could then negotiate North Korea's nuclear weapons away, it still leaves aside the fact that we believe North Korea is concerned about American aggression against North Korea. And so then you'd have to include American denuclearization, which gets us back to the point that all countries, except those outside the NPT, are committed to general and complete disarmament. And the 5 nuclear weapon states on the NPT are unequivocally committed to nuclear elimination, which they have not been aggressively pursuing. And all 5 are now engaged in nuclear modernization programs. So even if I could genetically accept the argument, I don't see a way that this solves the problem, but I see lots of ways that it makes it worse. But Joel's right. There's been a lot of debate in the academic space about whether they can be stabilizing. I'm not convinced of those arguments.
Other questions?
Hi, so I'm sort of piggybacking off of these two ladies' questions, but this is inevitable to see that, you know, as US ROK enhances their alliance and we reassurance the extended deterrence, I think North Korea might think that they have more leverage to send more defensive warnings. And based on your suggestion from the report that will be released soon, building the comprehensive communicative community in a more frequent cooperation to build greater confidence, you said would be another alternative, I guess, but this has to deal with the psychological part. But weren't you also concerned that it might increase North Korea's action, those provocative actions that might also kind of go against the alternative that you proposed?
I mean, obviously it has to be artfully done to have the reassurance effects in an effective way. You know, would it change North Korea's behavior? They might complain about it, but they're already missile testing, they're already nuclear testing, they're already, you know, working with Russia. So I do think, you know, it's like the military exercises. When the political situation was looking good, we were willing to stall the nuclear exercise or the military exercises in order to create the environment for negotiations. But now that there's no negotiations going on, there's no diplomacy going on, the North Koreans are refusing to come back to the table. You know, how long do we sit and wait? And again, and what message does that send to South Korea at a time of greater uncertainty? So I think there is, you know, a tactful way of doing it. And like I said, even if it's just creating greater visibility as to what the consultative bodies are, and what they're supposed to be doing, and that, you know, consultation goes on. I mean, we publicize all the time about the special envoys meeting in a trilateral basis on a regular basis. We should be talking also about that, you know, given the uncertainty of the times, that there is actual consultation going on, as well as how the alliance needs to adapt, how our policies and practices are adapting to the times as well, you know, without it necessarily being super antagonistic, like, oh, we're going to do kill chain, or we're going to do massive exercises, or, you know, just the idea that there's ongoing cooperation, I think, can have a very good psychological effect in South Korea.
You know, it boils down to, are we confident in our ability to deter North Korea or not? I mean, that's sort of the overarching theme. And I think you could fill in the blanks without, you know, talking about kill chain, without talking about, you know, wiping out the leadership. You could sort of construct that message in a way that it's not easy, because of course there are different people who are going to be talking, but that's sort of the organizing thing. Second point is, and I think John brought this up earlier, you know, you can have that theme, but you can also say, hey, you know, we're not just willing to talk anywhere, anytime, like we say now, and no one takes that serious. We can come up with different initiatives, diplomatic initiatives. And even if the North Koreans don't say yes, that's okay, because, you know, we're looking good. We're trying to resolve this diplomatically. And that'll, you know, that reinforces the perception in your allies that, you know, you really are trying. Maybe I'm the only one who thinks we're not trying now, but anyway, I think those two things are very
This is a question from online from Alexander Bishop. To prevent a polynuclear Northeast Asia, should we create an Asian equivalent to NATO's nuclear planning group to increase participation by South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and others in decision-making on deterrence strategy, declaratory policy exercises, and contingency planning on nuclear weapons?
So this is an issue that has been raised over a number of years, that as the United States and their allies in East Asia face the challenge of China and North Korea, should we mirror some of the processes that have been engaged in NATO? I think there are two challenges to doing so. I'm not opposed to it in theory, but there are two challenges. One is, NATO is a unified alliance with a unified military command structure, which is lacking in East Asia. And so it's difficult to simply apply one model to the other without recognizing there are some differences there. Doesn't mean don't do it, but the going in position has to be one where you have to recognize you're not going to get the same result. So within NATO, you have the nuclear planning group, you have the high level group, you have a political process that's built in by treaty, which enables the sharing of information, the sharing of classified military information in a way that doesn't exist in East Asia. The second is, and this is, again, not a reason not to do it, but the perception of South Korea, Japan, Australia, and other countries as to the threat is different, and therefore is a challenge. You have that in NATO as well, but there are more unifying things within NATO, particularly now as a result of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, that makes it easier to have those conversations. So I think first, before you sort of jump to that model, there needs to be broader trilateral and multilateral engagement, political, military, and civil society, to determine whether or not you've got a common basis for planning. And if you do, then you can see whether or not things like nuclear sharing or military integration help. Right now, we're doing that on an ad hoc basis. That's a lot of what Colin Kahl and Eli Ratner and Kirk Campbell spend their day jobs and night jobs, and in Kurt's case, his third and fourth day jobs doing. But it's hard to do, and you don't see the similar overlap. But the idea is there, and I think has been brought up by individual allies when it comes to things like nuclear sharing and nuclear planning, but it's an imperfect model, and I think there are challenges to do it.
I agree.
Thanks. Then I must be right.
Any other questions? More online?
Yep, we have more from online. This one's from Joseph Bosco. If denuclearization is now an unrealistic goal, what about focusing on the rehumanization of the North Korean people, i.e. challenging the legitimacy of the Kim regime, as Trump initially did with 3 major speeches on Kim's human rights record?
Well, this is always a big dilemma for US policymakers. How do you balance the human rights angles here with the security issue? I think my feeling based on my experience is that you can make more progress on human rights issues if you do it in a low-key way. And if you do that in the context of trying to reach accommodations on security. So it depends on what you're trying to do. If you want to name and shame, sure, then speeches are great. But if you're trying to actually make forward movement, then, you know, a more low-key approach is going to work. But one last issue here, though, is, you know, people always talk, they've been talking for decades about, gee, if only North Korea would collapse. If only, you know, the regime would disappear. Well, you know, if you talk to anyone who's done planning, military planning, other kinds of planning, in terms of collapse in the US or other governments, they will tell you that's a nightmare you don't want to have. Because the collapse of North Korea has so many different implications, including the possibility of triggering a US-Chinese military confrontation that you don't want to go to.
I would just add to that in terms of targeting the leadership again. I think you see in North Korea's nuclear strategy that is something that they take very personally, and can be more agitating to the situation than helpful. You know, if you think that naming and shaming the leadership is going to force the leadership to actually change its behavior, I think that's a wrong assumption. Whereas, you know, trying to build diplomatic inroads in order to have a more productive conversation is going to get farther faster.
I mean, I should add, there are people who've been human rights envoys who would agree with me. For example, Bob King, who was the Obama administration's human rights envoy. I think he feels the same way, that, you know, it's, you can have human rights dialogues with the North Koreans and you might even make progress. But the only way you're going to do that is if you have the right context. And we end at 12.
Do whatever you want. You're in charge.
Well, if there are more questions, let's take them.
Okay.
Okay, I've got a quick question. At the beginning, you talked about the US becoming a little less predictable. Certainly during the Trump presidency, a lot of US foreign policy was turned on its head. But if we look at what's happened in Ukraine recently, I'd say it's been a pretty good example of the US standing with its allies and trying to, you know, protect and promote security in Europe. So looking forward, is this sort of unpredictability something that you think will continue? And if President Trump or someone in his ilk doesn't run and get re-elected again, will that continue with other leaders as well, or do you think that was just an anomaly from back then, and Ukraine puts everything back on track?
I'm so glad you asked this question. Not because I'm a partisan political hack who likes to jump on people, but because I'm going to take the high road here. If you are a South Korean, you don't start your analysis with looking at the Trump administration. You go back a long way, even further than the pieces I will pick out, obviously, to the Korean War itself and talk about the formation of the alliance. But you go back to the Nixon administration and their recentering on both giving allies more capability themselves, so we're less integrated. You look at the Carter administration and the withdrawal of US troops, or the reduction of US troops, and how that was handled. You go to the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, right? There are long tails here. And so it's not that the behavior of Donald Trump was problematic, which it was, but it was another marker on the behavior of the United States towards South Korea in a way that wasn't predictable, wasn't seen ahead of time, and that showed that the United States was not always acting in what South Korea viewed as its own interest. And that's leaving aside the times when the South Korean government was prepared to do more with North Korea and we were opposed, or when we wanted to do more with North Korea and they were opposed. So you have to overlay all of these things, which is why in extended deterrent dialogues or in alliance management, a nuclear geek like me gets a nice table over in the left-hand side, and you have the regional experts and specialists who really understand and have lived in South Korea, have been diplomats there, speak the language and understand the history at the front of the table. Because it is about that relationship, which has lots of different components, the negotiators and the civil society groups and the nuclear pieces, but they all have to be integrated. So if you look at what the United States is doing now, if I were in government, I would say this shows the United States is back. It shows we're a reliable ally, and everybody would say yes. But who's coming around the corner? But that's true whether it was Trump or Bush or Nixon. So it's always that way, just as it is in South Korean government changes, and because that's part of the process.
I think it just means too that the planning and the contingency has a much wider range than it did before. So, not necessarily that they expect greater unpredictability in the US, but that they have to be ready for it just in case, because it is absolutely possible.
And the range of changes
Yeah.
is so much greater, right? So whereas 10, 20 years ago, you might say the worst thing that would happen is we move our base from the north to the south, or we go from 23,000 to 15,000. Now the worst case is tomorrow we announce we're getting out. And that affects the amount of things you can protect against and insulate the relationship from.
Most people forget Jimmy Carter wanted to pull out everyone too. Right? That's what he started out thinking. We get all our troops out. That's a long time ago. I'm not excusing anything Donald Trump did. But, on November 7th, Donald Trump could be president again. I mean, it's for many of us, not the ideal scenario, but it is something that people have to worry about. But you've raised another issue, which I think is very important. He may not be president. Hopefully he won't. But what about a Donald Trump wannabe? What are they going to do? If on November 7th, Ron DeSantis was the new president of the United States, what would he do? I mean, right now, none of us have any idea, and he probably has no idea either. But, is that particular mindset sort of so deep-seated among the Republican Party that he would go, well, yeah, I think this is a reasonable thing to do. Let's start withdrawing our troops from certain countries. Something to watch out.
Let me do something I rarely do, which is to defend the Republican Party, which is to say it is not unique in the Republican Party for people to argue that the United States should be less involved militarily overseas. And so the idea that we should be spending less, shouldn't have as many troops abroad, is also an idea that is espoused by parts of the Democratic Party. And it gets to this question of whether or not the United States is committed to and fully understands the benefits we accrue as a country by being a true international superpower. economically, politically, militarily, and otherwise. And that is less accepted today than it was when we were coming up, and something that is not just for Washington-based think tank and former government people to decide, but something that the country as itself decides through elections, and why that engagement is important. And we haven't talked about it at all today, but it's why things like foreign direct investment by South Korea in the United States, South Korean soft power in the United States in ways that were just as important for the United States overseas in the 20th century, movies and Coca-Cola and Ford Motors, is now BTS and K-pop and, you know, and Kia, right? I mean, and right, exactly, and Squid Games. I mean, it goes both ways now, and that's part of the relationship maturing, which I think is a good thing, but it also has to be strategically thought through. I finally got to work at BTS. I'm pretty happy about that.
Any other I think now we're about nearing the end. Any other online questions, or that was it?
That's it.
Okay. So, thank you very much, everyone, for being here for 2 hours. I think we covered not just extended deterrence, but a whole bunch of other issues, which is good. Is that what's going on?